first presentation of his review.
Thanks, Marie. I'll just bring up the presentation. Okay, so thanks for having me today. I'm really looking forward to present our work, which is a systematic scoping review and evidence gap map, exploring the impact of plastics used in the food system on human health, food security, economic and environmental domains. So the background and context for our review is, I think it's no surprise to anyone that there's a big debate going on in society around plastics, and there's some, pretty strong evidence coming out that they're having, detrimental effects on the natural environment. And many of these plastics that you see in the news and you see in policy debates are from the consumption end of the food system. And the wider context of plastics is that, they've been around for a long time, since the 1950s, and there's been a huge growth since that time in their production and use. Amazingly, packaging alone accounts for almost 40% or around 40% of all the plastics ever produced, and food and drink packaging accounts for 40% of that. So the food system has had quite a big stake in the game, and in some senses, this is only one end of the food system as well. What about plastics used in the sort of less visible elements of the food system, agricultural production, storage, transportation, and so forth? So I think with this increasing awareness of potential harms of plastics and the policies that are accompanying them, it's also good to sort of question, well, what are the benefits of plastics too? And that phrase, are you throwing the baby out with the bathwater in policy, seems to be quite important here, I think. So our motivation for this this review is really grounded in the Sustainable Development Goals and planetary health, and just how long we've got left to get a grip on these things. And especially as food system researchers, we ask ourselves, are food systems providing sustainable diets and equitable diets, affordable diets? And I think probably the short answer to that is no, currently, in their current form. And therefore, there's a role for food systems in this debate around plastics, and as I say, they're active stakeholders. And when policies are being formed, particularly circular economy policies and efforts to substitute plastics out, reduce, reuse, recycle, so forth, we need to be sure that we're accounting for the full range of consequences. And so we approach this large and diverse research landscape, and we want to try to bring together lots of different evidence that's been produced by different disciplines. We know there's been a focus on the environment, but we're also interested in how human health and food security and individual household economic outcomes being looked at in the research evidence as well. We hope that by doing this, we'll be creating a shared resource to connect research communities and aid decision making. So the aims of our study were to understand what is the extent, range and nature of the evidence on food system plastics as it relates to our three domains of interest, and where are there evidence gaps or opportunities for systematic reviews. So a quick word on how we approached it in terms of methods. For those of you who aren't so familiar with what a scoping review is and isn't, basically they depart from sort of conventional systematic reviews in the sense that they are much broader in scope. They approach often disparate fields of inquiry, and they seek to characterize the landscape and identify gaps in literature. They don't go into assessing causality or direction or strength of evidence or risk of bias. So, what you won't get from our research is a sort of X equals Y scenario, but we hope that it tees up, it creates the environment where people can ask those questions and answer them as well. So we grounded our exposure for this study in our food system and plastics. And to do this, we adapted a food system conceptualization by the FAO and by the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy, from farm to flush. So agricultural production, we know that lots of plastics are used. We also know that many plastics are used in processing, storage and distribution, as well as at the retail and sales and marketing stages. I think that's intuitive to us all because we see these plastics, and of course at the consumption level. Perhaps a lesser thought about area of the food system is waste disposal, where there's also a lot of plastic used as well. The other part of our exposure is the type of plastics that we're interested in. So we grounded ourselves in the 7 major groupings that you see here. I'm sure everyone will recognize these. So in order to be included in our review, you would have to have a study would need to show that a plastic was used from a particular sector in the food system and have to be one of those groupings of plastics at least, or many. This is the logic model we put together to help us hypothesize these relationships. And what we were looking for really is these types of plastics used in the food systems having a measurable outcome or effect on one of our 3 domains of human health, individual and household, food security and economics, and the environment. And you'll see from this logic model that we have both intermediate and final impact domain outcomes, and we've conceptualized these ourselves. And just to give you a quick example of how that might work, for human health, we would look at studies that, for instance, showed that an agricultural plastic was having an effect on food safety or the nutrient content of crops, or indeed, the presence of plastic particles or chemicals. We would assume that those foods would go on to be eaten, so we would call those intermediate outcomes. Whereas a final outcome under human health would be a study that shows the same plastics or plastics used in the food system having an effect or modeled effect on an actual physiological or human disease state. And if you look down the list, down the model, you can see, some other comparable examples in the different domains. Our search strategy, we searched the English language from the year 2000 onwards. It was a large search in 9 databases, and we registered our protocol with Campbell Collaboration. We've talked about the exposure and outcomes, but we were interested in any population apart from plastic itself, any geography of the world, and any evidence that was quantifiable. And one important criteria is that it would need to have an exposure comparator, apart from a few notable exceptions where there's a strong case for plastics, for instance, a post-mortem or case studies that showed that the cause of death or injury was from a food system plastic. I won't talk about our screening, but you'll see from the numbers that we're dealing with a lot of results. So we balanced. We worked with Prisma guidelines and we balanced speed and efficiency as well as we could. And this is detailed in our protocol, which you can find in the Wiley library. So this is our Prisma flow diagram. We had almost 100,000 records, which mercifully were cut in half after duplicates were removed, but that still left us with just shy of 50,000 records. After title and abstract, we were left with 8,681 for full text review. And finally, we were able to include 3,362 studies in this scoping review. So the results, I'm going to talk through the results quickly now in the order of the sort of big questions that we laid out. So the extent of the research. Food system plastics have been researched in every continent of the world, but 5 countries, USA, India, China, Spain and Italy dominate the landscape on this. And what's important to note is you see at the bottom of the screen here is that low-income countries, we found very little data from low-income countries, just 1.6% of the studies included in our review, which is quite striking and quite concerning given the proliferation of plastics, particularly single-use in those areas. On the bottom left, you can see the increase over time, so it's quite a sharp increase. Our search was conducted at the end of 2018, so I'm certain that the last 2 years we've seen an even more upward trend. In terms of how plastics have been studied across the food system, so going from left to right in the linear sort of progression of the food system, at the agricultural production level, we found that over 55% of our studies looked at plastics used here. Over 35% of the studies we found looked at plastics used in the processing, storage and distribution stages, with just 10% at the retail stages and 8% at household consumption, and only 4 studies at the waste disposal stage of the food system. So among the most popular well-studied plastics, we found a lot of research on plastic mulching. We found loads on greenhouses and also a lot on fisheries and nets, which probably explains why you see a lot the greenhouses, especially on Spain and Italy. In terms of the outcomes, the outcome domains that we found researched, food security indicators or outcomes that we found to be relevant to food security popped up the most. In over 2,500 studies considered at least one outcome in this area. Human health related outcomes were found in over 1,500 studies. That's almost 50% of our survey of our sample. And interestingly, we only found 282 studies that captured what we would determine to be an environmental outcome, which I think is quite interesting considering what's going on in the public debate. So a quick word now on what's probably the most important part is, you know, how plastics are used and what are their outcome relationships. So this graph here shows you the different parts of the food system: agricultural production at the top, waste disposal at the bottom, and the different outcome domains that are researched at each stage. And you can see really the two interesting stories here. Is one, as we've seen, that as you move along the food system, the concentration or the weight of research goes down, but also as you move along through the food system, the research priorities seem to shift. So whereas at the top in agricultural production, you find that there's lots of outcomes around food security, for instance, productivity, efficiencies, and not so much in comparative terms on human health, and certainly not as much on the environment. As you move along the food system, we find that there's a lot more proportionally looking at human health outcomes, and food security and economic outcomes seem to slip away. And that's probably to be expected, given the fact that, you know, as consumers begin to come into contact more with products, there's more interest in understanding what their effects. This is just another way to look at that, in case you like spider diagrams like me. So I just want to quickly focus in, I'm conscious of time, on agricultural production, particularly because I think I'm talking about areas of the food system which are probably less visible to large portions of the population. So when you look at agricultural production, we look at how plastics used at this stage have been researched in relation to outcomes. So what you're looking at here is a frequency of outcome categories. So this is not the number of studies, it's the number of outcomes that are captured in total. And one thing I want to draw your attention to here is that in each of these outcome areas, particularly in food security, we see that there's a strong focus on productivity and efficiency. So how, for instance, does plastic mulch improve crop yield and water use efficiency? But really hardly anything in relative terms compared to how those same plastics might have a detrimental effect on the same production systems, for instance, by leaving residues in the soil. The same thing can be said for human health, where we see nutrient contents of foods being studied, but not so much the contamination of those foods by plastics. And across all of our review samples, we found that there was not many studies that went all the way to show a final impact, for instance, on human health. In this respect, in agricultural production, just 7 studies, and only 4 studies were able to capture changes in income, for instance, and food security indicators related to agricultural production. So the final note on the results here is about the nature and the types of studies that we found. Unsurprisingly, most of what we found were experimental designs, and that's probably because our review is quite impact driven and quantitative, but we did see a whole range of other study designs too. One very striking thing that came out of this gap map and review was that very few meta-analyses. We found just 8, and all of them look at plastic mulch. In fact, at times it felt like we were doing a review on mulch only. And one thing I want to draw your attention to is that all of these reviews talk about plastic mulch in relation to efficiencies and productivities in agriculture, but only one looks at the potential impact, long-term impact that things like residue from plastic might be having on the soil. And this is an interesting quote from that review, which is, I guess, a cautionary tale. And I think this points towards the fact that there may be more work to do in this space, because this review just looked at the Chinese context only. So this is the gap map. It's going to be available online soon. It's a really useful resource. It's got, as I say, over 3,300 studies in it. You can really customize your navigation through the gap map by plastic type, location, study design, any of the impact domains and specific outcomes, as well as, where plastics and how, where and how they're used across food systems. Quick word on the strengths and limitations of this study. I think, some of the strengths are that this is, we think the first review of its kind in this area, and it's a huge topic area. I think it's an interdisciplinary approach to something which is multidisciplinary in nature. So it's going to be relevant to lots of different sectors and disciplines, and we hope that people will explore the data, and this might foster new collaborations or point towards new systematic reviews, and maybe take us a step closer to being able to quantify trade-offs associated with withdrawing plastics or replacing them. One of the major limitations of this is that applying a systematic approach to such a multidisciplinary topic means that you can't account for every type of study design, and therefore there have been some notable exclusions, like prevalence studies that didn't have, oftentimes don't have a comparator group, so we couldn't include those. It's not a systematic review, so there's no causality here. And also we had to limit ourselves to the types of plastics that I presented earlier, and we do acknowledge that there are many other newer technologies in plastics, bioplastics, organic plastics that are coming out, but that whole area, at least for me, felt like a moving target because it's changing so quickly. So I think that would be something to incorporate in the future. So just some summing up here on the conclusions of this, and then I'm going to talk about what COVID has done or what we've learned from the process, and what can shed light on this new era we're in. But in terms of what we've noticed from this evidence base, we see there's some strong build-ups of evidence around plastic mulching, storage and transportation and packaging, unsurprisingly. But we do see some gaps as well, especially where those same items of plastic were studied, but perhaps not in looking at outcomes to give the full picture, like contamination with plastics. We didn't find much on takeaways, surprisingly, for all of the noise out there in the public domain, especially leaching of chemicals and plastics. Not much recorded in human populations, for instance, changes in food security indicators, incomes, health outcomes, and of course, very little low-income setting data. So we think that is a big problem that needs to be addressed, and some methodological considerations as well, which I'm happy to talk about another time. In terms of implications for research and perhaps policy, as I say, we hope this takes us a step towards quantifying trade-offs, especially where circular economy policies are concerned. This, we hope, will foster cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary research. And one of the things that I started worrying about through this process was, risk assessments are often vertical, looking at certain products, but what about a cumulative risk of exposure to chemicals, which you find in plastics and products, both within and outside the food system, that may have the same mechanisms in the body, but may not be looked at in a joined up approach. And that leads to the final point on, how do we join the dots to causal pathways here? I want to say thanks to our funder, which was a UK aid through the Amana programme, and the co-authors who have worked on this, particularly Megan Deeney, who's done so much, and Sunita Kadiala, and we had the guidance of Howard White, which is brilliant through the process, and Heike Rolke and Sophia Kalimatiano, who did so much too. And the people at, the folks at Campbell Collaboration have been really supportive through this process. These are some references, quite a few, but plenty more in our protocol if you want to have a look. Now, this is a kind of just of, more of a kind of ponderings that I was thinking about in the last week, but how has this process gone, and what new implications are there when it comes to COVID? So I won't go through all of these in detail, but I would say, you know, some of the big things that stood out throughout this 2-year journey we've been on is, you know, databases and access. We had to find 49,000 studies to look at. Yes, they were abstract, but we then had to find 8,500 to read at full text. And this can be very, very slow, you know, trying to get access to databases. And also it makes me think about equity. Who is able to afford to do this kind of research? And are we talking about inequities in global research landscapes? And I think that's something to really think about. In terms of scoping reviews, you know, this was a big one. I think I've heard about bigger ones. Someone said to me, someone mentioned one with 1 million articles in it the other day. I'm not sure if that could be possible, but I felt like crying and just thinking about that. But, you know, they do seem to be increasingly needed because the bodies of evidence are increasing. So how do you balance scope, breadth, depth, accuracy and speed, you know, and relevance? You know, we did our search, you know, a year and a half ago now, and we need to get it published so that it's relevant. One of the things we noticed is that it's a long process and often it's hard to remember and untangle all your deliberations that you had during that time. In terms of COVID-19 itself and the implications that it's had on plastics, I think these are 3 sort of big areas that worry me. One is that I think everyone will appreciate that single-use plastics have had a massive increase this year. You know, maybe they're more hygienic in some sense, in some situations, maybe they're not. You know, people have had food deliveries, maybe that's helping to bring down the cost of food and it's making food more accessible. So maybe there's economic implications there. And what about medical feeding? You know, where does the food system end? Does it go into tubes that people are fed with? You know, these are important things for us to consider. But one thing we know for sure is that there's a rapid increase in plastics just at a time when the world seemed to be thinking about taking on this problem. Then also we've seen that there's lower recycling rates in many countries because there's a perceived risk that the plastics can harbour pathogens and bacteria for longer than other materials. And of course this in the bottom right hand corner, this lovely news that you know, the big fossil fuel companies have now set their sights on flooding new markets with plastics because, you know, the price of oil is going down and the price of plastics is also going down. So I think there's a lot to be concerned about, but also hopefully in doing this work, it helps to join the dots more between economic, environmental and food security outcomes, and hopefully this issue can be approached with more joined up thinking. Thanks very much.
Wonderful.